Good morning to everybody from a sunny and very hot Brussels. I would like to thank the organizers for the opportunity you give me to be with you, though remotely. SEC2SV provides a valuable space for cutting-edge tech entrepreneurs to talk to policymakers, especially European ones. Europe is investing in innovation, but we are also investing in a new generation of rules of the road. This is not regulation for the sake of regulation. It's about balancing interests of consumer and trader in the marketplace.
So, just to the next one. By the way, a sunny day in Brussels is not that obvious, not that frequent. So and probably has been the best week ever in the last 5 years this week. So that's why I was mentioning. So now I'd like to call on stage the moderator of the next panel, John Miller, Vice President of ITI, that is one of our partners in the Startup Europe Comes to Silicon Valley Week. John, the stage is yours.
And I'd like to also invite our panelists to come up as well. We have Krysten, Jenci, Audrey Plonk, and also Leonard Koschwitz, who didn't make it onto the screen because he was a late replacement for someone else who didn't make it. So while they're gathering, and I'll sit here in a moment, but while they're gathering, let me just introduce you really briefly to ITI. Again, I'm Vice President for Global Policy and Law for ITI, the Information Technology Industry Council. We are a DC-based policy advocacy association comprised of basically the world's leading technology companies. We have many of the sponsors on the front of this lectern here. We also have many sponsors globally. I should say we have many members globally. We have companies that are based outside the U.S. About 1/3 of our members, including someone from the last panel, Schneider Electric, SAP, Samsung, Lenovo, and then many other tech companies here in the U.S. as well. And we really, our companies really advocate the same and very consistent policy messages globally, no matter what capitals the governments are located in. And core to all of those messages are the topics of this panel: privacy, security, data flows. These issues are so important. Privacy and security, why is that important? It's important because of trust. Trust is important to our companies and our businesses, and it's certainly important to consumers and governments. And then when we talk about data, data is really at the center of everything that entrepreneurs are doing, and particularly as we look not only at the second wave, but towards the third wave that we'll be seeing in the coming years, and an internet of everything, and leveraging things such as big data analytics. So without further ado, let's dive into this great discussion, and let me introduce our panelists. We have, and I'll let them add to these brief introductions, but on the right we have Audrey Plonk, who's the Director of Government and Policy at Intel Corporation, and she certainly works on all these issues, as well as a whole number of other issues at Intel. I think those who know Audrey will say she's kind of doing everything over there right now in many ways, including working on internet governance and trade issues as well. Then we have Krysten Jenci, who is also doing a lot of things, as you'll see. She's the Director of the Office of Digital Services Industries at the Department of Commerce's International Trade Administration. As Director, Krysten oversees 2 teams that provide expertise on a number of internet trade policy issues, both the Data Flows and Privacy team and the Digital Internet Services team. And then we have Leonard Koschwitz, who's a Director for European Affairs for Allied for Startups, a worldwide network of advocacy organizations. And Leonard is based in Brussels and also has experience with the Parliament. So as you can see, we definitely have 3 great and diverse perspectives on this panel. And let's jump in with the... Let's jump in with the first question. I'm really just wondering if, based on your experiences, what some of the biggest issues that you're dealing with at the center, really at the intersection of these issues, privacy, security, data flows. There's plenty of issues that kind of are standing alone in these areas, but increasingly, these issues are colliding, and it's making the policy landscape a little more complicated, particularly as we look at it globally. So, Audrey, I mean, what are the challenges in your work that you're seeing on these issues?
Thanks, John, and thanks for having me today. Well, I think that in 10 or 12 years ago, we used to think of privacy as its own sort of distinct practice area, often a very legal kind of concept based in law, whether you're in Europe or in the United States or in another country, and security as a very technical thing that sort of people that lawyers didn't talk to dealt with, and and trade is something that was really just about moving goods across borders. And, the internet has obviously changed everybody's life, but it's certainly, from my point of view at least, merged those concepts into almost like a triangle. And in some ways this is great because we've realized that you can't really have much privacy if you don't have a lot of security. You can't have, security is not really all that useful if you're not protecting something, and usually we're trying to protect data or secrets or something. And the more global things get, the more global the internet has gotten, and the more data that devices are generating, the more governments and people just generally are realizing that the currency that we're trading are the data, and they're moving across national boundaries and borders. And so that's essentially a trade issue in the very classical way that trade people would think of trade. So I think it feels very much like these are merging together, and then you look at things like, the global debate around encryption and what kind of security we should be allowed to do in products. Obviously, that could be its own discussion, and I don't think we're going to get as deep into that, but it's certainly an element of how do you protect data, what kind of technologies you can use. So it's almost like the perfect moment in history, since we're at the History Museum, to think about the convergence of all these issues.
Thanks, Audrey. Krysten, how about in your world? I know you're working on all these issues as well, as including some prominent, some would say notorious policy issues recently.
Well, thanks. I just want to note here at the beginning, I'm still recovering from Tim Draper's comments at the beginning that government was the worst offender in terms of offering the worst service at the highest cost. So we'll try to work on that, be more innovative. But I do want to note, being the good bureaucrat that I am, that I'm speaking from my personal opinions and not representing the views of the Department of Commerce. So as John was saying, we've had some very high-profile issues of late. Our office administers this, what's now called the EU-US Privacy Shield Framework. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but it has certainly made us very aware of the issues that small and medium-sized businesses face in terms of trying to comply with global privacy legislation and regulations. And I think one great data point to underscore that is that about 60% of the companies that were in Safe Harbor, which was the predecessor to Privacy Shield, were small and medium-sized businesses. And so if you really think about, what it takes to comply with different laws all over the world on privacy, it's a pretty expensive proposition. You have to have lawyers, and as one of the panelists was saying just before us, the startup guys, they run away. They look at piles of paper and legal documents. It's kind of like me. I don't want to read a 25-page privacy policy. I really don't. And I'm supposed to be somebody that's aware of this stuff. So, how are you going to make privacy compliance accessible to startups, to small and medium-sized businesses? And another good data point was this McKinsey Global Institute study that was issued in March of 2016. Many of you probably seen it. But to go to Audrey's point, this study actually showed that trade in data flows is more important than merchandise trade. So trade in, data flows are more important to trade than this traditional exchange, import, export of goods. That's huge. And part of this survey also noted that 2/3 of the startups that they surveyed here were doing business overseas. They had either had users or customers in other countries. So, startups, everybody has to be able to comply, or you're going to get in trouble. Everybody wants to ensure consumer trust, as John was saying. It's so important. Everybody wants to protect privacy, but how are you going to do it in a way that is realistic and reasonable for companies? And that's why we at the Commerce Department have been so supportive of the efforts for Privacy Shield, is because we feel like this is one way to make it accessible to smaller companies. And so, I know I'm talking about a very specific example with Privacy Shield, but I do think the challenges around data flows are significant and only growing, and that's the challenge we're trying to face.
Thanks, Krysten. Leonard, it might be a different question for you from your vantage point working with startups if I say, what are the biggest policy issues that startups are and entrepreneurs are dealing with, at least based on my limited experience with the community. A lot of times what I've heard is that even people at scale-ups will say, we don't have time to deal with policy issues. Those are big company issues. I think Krysten and Audrey were just describing how these issues are complicated even for the largest companies. I mean, from the perspective of startups and from your work, what are the challenges? Is it simply getting them to focus in this area, or is it something else?
Well, I would say that looking at privacy or data protection, one thing that is clearly present amongst all startups and startup entrepreneurs is that there is an obvious case that data has to be secure, data has to be protected. Now, I think comparing the more technological debate and the debate that happens in policy circles, there might indeed be a big difference of how this can happen. You mentioned earlier terms and conditions which can be outrageously long and hard to sign up. And in the EU, for example, policymakers came up with a cookie law, which now obliges you to click and accept terms and conditions whenever you visit the site. It doesn't really mean that you actually read them. So I think there's consensus that personal data has to be protected, but the way how to get there is something where a dialogue can benefit. But one thing is clear, that not only European startups, but any startup in the world that wants to do either business in the EU or is located in the EU will have to comply with the General Data Protection Regulation as of 2018. And as the data protection supervisor was saying in the video before, this is actually giving quite precise rules on how to comply. And one of the propositions we have is, because as was mentioned earlier, that this is actually a bit of we have to strike a balance between two different fundamental rights here: a fundamental right on data protection, but also fundamental right on doing business, and the European fundamental rights on free circulation of services, for example. That this is actually empowering for both communities, the policy community or the regulatory community, and the startup or business community, to have a deeper dialogue here on how to make data protection work in practice, not only in policy papers.
Thanks. And you mentioned a couple of different kind of aspects of geography, if you will. I guess a two-part question. First is just kind of to focus on whether or not Krysten, you mentioned Privacy Shield. And we heard a little bit earlier also about EU and US policymakers. Are EU and US policymakers, getting on? Are they on the same page with respect to these issues? Is I guess the first part of the question, and then the second part of the question is, what about the rest of the globe, right? this conference is focused obviously on the bridge between Silicon Valley and European startups, but I'm pretty sure that most startups and entrepreneurs in the room don't aspire to just do business especially in the technology sector, to just do business in the US or to just do business in Europe. Everyone aspires to be a global company, and that's the way the internet has always functioned. And it's becoming more and more of a challenge, it seems, with siloed policymaking in a few different areas we could potentially get into. So, I mean, I guess the first part first, Krysten, what do you think about the EU and the US on some of these key issues right now? Not only Privacy Shield, but trade agreements as well. That's another key issue.
Sure. Well, it's a great question. I'm just going to say this because I think it's worth noting, and I'll go beyond Privacy Shield, I promise, in 2 seconds, is just, I think Privacy Shield, the fact that we came to a agreement and it got adequacy is a great testament to our ability to face significant challenges in a very challenging political environment, right? Thanks to Snowden and everybody else. I mean, this is a very difficult and challenging policy environment in which to come to an agreement. And you know that we like to think of Safe Harbor and Privacy Shield as building the bridge between the US and Europe. And under very difficult circumstances, I do think we were able to come to an agreement that, hopefully will stand the test of time, although, it will be a challenging road ahead. I also want to note, in this Privacy Shield debate and context, it's easy to say, the US and Europe have fundamentally different approaches, they don't share anything. But, if you really think about it, the principles, I think we all share the same principles. If you look at, commonly accepted privacy principles going back to the OECD privacy framework or the 1995 EU directive, we all sign on and support the same principles: notice, access, choice, data security standards, correction. I mean, we agree on all those things. It's just, how do you get there? How do you get to the compliance piece? And, really there is a lot of area of agreement. Now, in some of the other areas that we're working on, like TTIP, obviously the Commerce Department is working very closely with our friends at the Trade Representative's Office on the data flow provisions in TTIP. Now, there's a lot of room for optimism there. I mean, we can say, now that we've turned the page on Privacy Shield, how can we work together and do a better job? Because clearly there's so much to gain by having an agreement with our biggest trading partner. We're the two biggest trading partners in the world. I mean, it would be tremendously advantageous to us as global partners to get something done here and to try to, set an example for the rest of the world, right? Latin America, Asia, everything else. So, and also, of course, in the digital single market proposals, of which there are so many, I think there are, the U.S. government and the Commerce Department, we're trying to engage everywhere we can on a number of different proposals, including one on startups that I think there's going to be more details on in November. But I think there's a lot of areas for cooperation there. And then to get to the second part of your question in terms of other regions, we're trying to work with Europe, even in this context of facilitating interoperability between privacy frameworks between Europe and Asia. So we're trying to think, globally, wouldn't it be nice, instead of having to comply with privacy regimes in all these different regions and countries, if you could just do one privacy compliance framework that would get you, you could check the box on compliance requirements in Europe, the United States, and Asia. Now that's a long off dream, but it's a great one to think about. And I think one that would be really useful for startups and small companies who don't have the resources to deal with all these different regulations.
Thanks. And Audrey, I mean, any thoughts on the size of the delta between U.S. and EU policymakers right now? Or I know you focus on policy problems or issues in other parts of the world as well. Any of note from your perspective in this area?
Well, no, I mean, I think Krysten covered the Privacy Shield situation better than any of us could. I don't disagree. I think everybody's sense of what needs to happen, we agree on the goals. We don't necessarily agree on how to get there between the two countries. I think industry doesn't always align with either country either, like either side of the Atlantic. So, and I think it puts companies in often an awkward position of where they're located being sort of, associated with a particular political philosophy around these things, which is not, necessarily always the case. But there's lots of examples of where the US and Europe, I think, have cooperated really well. Europe issued the Network and Information Security Directive about 6 months ago-ish. And I think that was a good collaborative effort, fairly. There are a few little bumps along the way, but a fairly broad concept of how to bring intra-Europe standards up to sort of a harmonized level of security across different EU member states, and that was in the works for a very long time. So I think there's good cooperation with regard to other countries outside of not the U.S. or Europe. It's hard to imagine today, at least, and I'm not a trade expert, I'm not a trade lawyer by training, but it's really hard to imagine today any kind of trade agreement that doesn't deal with data flows. It's just really, really hard to imagine, given that the biggest trending policy topic for governments is, oh my gosh, how do we keep all this data in our country? And the biggest trending topic in technology is, oh my gosh, how do we send the data everywhere? And so they're like, dramatically running into each other. And so of course it's, you've really grown up as an industry when you're in a trade agreement. It feels like no longer is privacy this little esoteric thing over the side, or security this little esoteric thing over the side. Like, it's grown up, it's mainstream.
Absolutely. Leonard, I don't know if you have thoughts on that issue, but one way or the other, I do want to bring the conversation back to the audience in the room and startups and entrepreneurs, just to kind of get your perspective on, whether some of these issues, again, are some of the smaller companies focused on trade agreements? I mean, I probably should have done an acronym check earlier. I'm not sure how many people know what TTIP is necessarily, probably, or maybe a lot do, but Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. What is the challenge from your perspective from the entrepreneur and startup community on these issues? And also, are your companies doing business in other geographies too, where you're running into some of these issues?
So yeah, I would like to make actually two examples with regards to the GDPR. So here's one thing where the GDPR has succeeded. Instead of 28 different regimes on how to protect data within the European Union, we have now one. So that's a great thing. And also where we have succeeded in a transatlantic aspect is that with the Privacy Shield, it's enough to tick a box and to be compliant, which is paradise for a small company compared to alternatives that have been advocated also strangely by the Commission before. But here's where the GDPR has failed, and this is where it becomes really relevant for a small company that deals with data. The GDPR has a clear approach or a clear ambition to create or to respect the particular situation of a small company with 1, 2, 3, 5 staff. But if you're a small flower shop, that clearly applies. But if you're a 2-3 person startup that processes 5,001 data subjects a year, you have to fulfill the same compliance requirements as any big company. And this is where the sort of the execution or the aim has failed, and a small data-driven company is hit much harder than a small analog company, and the GDPR sort of fails in seeing one economy, but it still makes a distinction between a digital and a non-digital economy, which I think is it's not fit for 216.
So there's definitely a resources issue in complying if you're a small digital company having 5,000 or more customers, which isn't that much in sales, all things considered.
Exactly, and this is simply the data subjects you're processing over a year, and to be very precise, this means, well, employee 1, 2, and 3 can be 2 co-founders and a developer, but 4 and 5 has to be a data protection officer and probably an in-house lawyer to handle that. But we don't want to be negative only. There is a good way of addressing that as well, and we believe that good way could be to foster a dialogue between data protection authorities, which are the regulators within the EU, and startup communities, helping the regulator to better understand how an innovative data processing works, and enabling them to make faster decisions on whether a processing is appropriate or not.
And I mean, organizations like yours, Allied for Startups, are working with organizations like ITI and trying to help bridge that gap. Audrey, I mean, from the perspective of a large Silicon Valley company, I mean, is there more that large companies can be doing to influence the policy space for startups and entrepreneurs from your perspective, or that you are doing already?
Yeah, that's a good question. I worked a bit with Intel Capital, our investment arm that deals with startups, and I think there's some interesting dynamics. So if you meet with, for example, Mr. Butarelli, the regulators don't want to hear as much from big companies. They want to hear from startups. They want to hear what the challenges are, the real sort of rubber hits the road challenges, because they know that big companies have armies of lawyers and lots of compliance people and lots of policy people, and that, and maybe we don't have enough, but we have more than a 3-person startup. And so they really want to hear more from about how innovation is changing so that they can better develop policies that will not stifle it or that will not prohibit their local economy from innovating. And so I think that's always a challenge. People come to Silicon Valley and they say, we're going to go see the startups. And then they're like, and the startups are like, who are you? Oh, we don't have time, we're off doing our other things. So that is where there's some, I think like Allied for Startups and some other organizations, trade associations and stuff have helped, educate both the policymakers and some of the companies on the ground about how to cooperate and how to share some of the responsibility of influencing these policies. I will say that in the companies that, like within Intel Capital, there's a section that really does focus on startups working in the solution space here. So that's an element we haven't talked about yet. As there's all these problems, and we're talking a lot about policy and regulatory solutions and not as much about innovative technical solutions. And so there is a whole arm of Silicon Valley and the startup community that are being funded by venture capital, but also by capital arms of bigger corporations, to look at how do we solve these data transfer problems? How do we know where a set of data are located? Can we attest to that? Can we certify to that? Can we simplify these processes in a mechanical or technical way that would appease regulatory needs or requirements or security concerns or whatever the issue is? And so I think that's a compelling, for the startup community to think about, especially in Europe as the regulatory environment changes. Can we leverage the technology to help us solve the problems?
Thanks, Audrey. And we're almost out of time, but Krysten, I do want to give you an opportunity. Does government have a role to play here in bridging the gap between to the startups? I mean, whether it's the Department of Commerce or the European Commission or anyone else?
Well, I think that's one lesson we learned in the privacy context, is that we need to do more outreach, both with the companies and with the regulators in Europe. That's something that we've all agreed upon, that we need to be doing more with the data protection authorities in all the countries, just to make sure we're all speaking the same language and on the same page. Because I think we do, like I was saying, I do think we share a lot of goals in terms of the principles, but I also think in a larger context, we all share the goal of facilitating innovation, promoting trade, especially at the Department of Commerce. That's our job. We're supposed to be facilitating trade and economic growth. We also want to build consumer trust and protect privacy, all these things. But, it's going to take a lot of cooperation and a lot of understanding and a lot of just dialogue to ensure that we can achieve those goals and not allow these other things to get in our way. And so I do think the Commerce Department has a great role to play in terms of trying to find solutions to those challenges. And I would say again, since 60% of the companies that used Safe Harbor in order to comply with the EU law were SMEs, that Privacy Shield represents a great option for companies to consider and allow them to meet the requirements of the law. And we feel very optimistic that Privacy Shield's going to be a really good thing if we can continue this outreach and continue the dialogue. That we feel very excited about the number of companies that have already signed up and the road ahead. We think it's going to be, we feel very optimistic that it's going to be a good outcome.
All right, well, we'll have to leave it there on that optimistic note from the government. Thank you very much to all of our panelists.